Phew. That's a close one. Sorry, I had to swallow down my dinner. All right. So, Congress and the president. Here we go. Decided that we need to hit this hard and get in and get out. My one test-taking tip for this session is that there are questions on the test that are written knowing that only 10% of the test takers are going to get them right. Okay? So, don't do what I did when I used to... Yeah. Press the button. Home button on my iPad. When I took a test and I would come up against a question that I didn't know the answer to, I would, freak out and think, oh my gosh, they must think that we're supposed to know that, and I don't know that, so I must not be smart or something. So, the test questions are really variated in terms of difficulty, and there really are some questions on there that, no one's supposed to get right. So, don't let those freak you out, okay? When you come across a question like that, they're going to be very picky, very detailed, picky questions, and we could knock ourselves out here and try and cover every little tiny thing, but we just can't do it. And so, you're just going to have to understand that there's going to be some questions that you don't know the answer to, and just move on, okay? Guess, and move on, okay? Eliminate the answers you know are wrong, and then keep going. All right, so today we're doing Congress and the presidency, okay? So, we all know, hopefully now, that we have representatives in Congress, that there's a Senate and House of Representatives. Generally, these are all people who are generalists, which means that they know a little bit about lots of things, but they don't know a whole lot about any one thing. And it is the job of committee involvement and interest groups and lobbyists and staffers and all of those people to turn them into specialists in specific areas in which relate to their committee work. But in general, they are generalists. 90% of the people who run for re-election in the House of Representatives get reelected. And so the incumbency advantage in the House of Representatives is much greater than in the Senate. If you think about it, it makes sense because the districts are drawn in a gerrymandered way, typically, which we'll get to what that means in a minute. But usually the districts are drawn to the advantage of a specific group. And so it's pretty predictable who's going to win that district. Whereas the Senate is a statewide office. And it can be rather volatile, particularly in a state like North Carolina, who's going to get 51% of the vote in any Senate race. So we saw it with Senator Kay Hagan, for example. She was an incumbent senator who was voted out of office by Tom Tillis. So that was an example of a volatile Senate. All right, so we know what franking is. Franking is when elected officials, according to the Constitution, are allowed to send mail to their constituents and inform them of their activities in Washington, and this is a way in which they gain name recognition and helps with the incumbency advantage. If you remember with Renee Elmers, we talked about this in class, about how she was using her franking privileges in ways that were controversial in the state. The other way that incumbents can help increase their chances of getting reelected is through pork barrel projects. That's one name for these projects that they get funding to build things in their district or help a specific constituency in their district, and that they can talk about that when they come home to run for re-election, that they got this park built or that thing built. Yes, do you need me?
Yeah, can I watch TV?
Sure.
Thanks,
Okay. And another name for those are earmarks, okay? And earmarks and pork barrels get a bad name, but really sometimes they're the way you get compromise to happen. Like you pull in a couple recalcitrant representatives to vote for your bill by offering them an earmark or a pork barrel. So the line item veto was given to President Clinton as a means of eliminating earmarks, that he could go into a bill and just eliminate all the earmarks. And some people thought that seemed like a great reform idea. We're starting to see how, with the polarization in Congress and how you can't get people to compromise, that maybe it's time to bring the earmark back, and maybe that would be a way you could get Congress people to hold hands and compromise. So that continues to be an issue. And then, of course, their party identification is important. Some people will just, based on what their party is, can count on their district being drawn in such a way that their party is destined to win. So party identification is important as well. All right, so gerrymandering. let's make sure we know how the House of Representatives is formed. So they have left it to the states. We take a census every 10 years. And they have left it to the states to take the census data and figure out how many districts they get. So North Carolina gets 13 based on our population. Then it's up to the state legislature to draw the districts, the 13 districts, and assign them to be represented, one representative for each of those 13 districts. Now, the party that has the majority in the state legislature at that time typically draws the districts to their advantage. And this can be done through packing and cracking, okay? Packing is when you pack a district with a particular kind of person who you can then make it a safe district for that group. And cracking is when you divide a population into two separate districts so that you can lessen their influence and make it less likely that they will elect a representative because they were cracked. Okay? A famous court case was in 1995 here in North Carolina. It was called Shaw versus Reno. It was about the 12th district, which was drawn to try and maximize the number of black people who lived in that district. They had good intentions. They were Democrats. The state legislature was dominated by Democrats at the time, and they were trying to be in compliance with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which said you could try and create some majority-minority districts to increase the number of minorities elected to Congress. But in Shaw versus Reno, this 12th district case, they said that they had overdone it, that they needed a compelling state interest, and that there's a certain amount of compactness that the Supreme Court has said and contiguity, contiguous and compactness, that the Supreme Court is looking for when drawing districts. And so they shot that district down, to everyone's surprise, because they thought that they were in line with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So now we're at this kind of like little Three Bears problem where we got to get it just right. Too hot, too cold. The districts need to be. We're still trying to figure out what is the absolute standards for district drawing. All right, so that's related to gerrymandering. All right, now we're moving on to the House of Representatives specifically. The House of Representatives has 435 people in it. It's based on population. And the census, you have to be at least 25 years old. You have to live in your district to represent that district. Remember, the House of Representatives, since it is so large, it has to be much more organized, centralized, hierarchical, institutionalized. There's a lot more party loyalty within the House of Representatives. Each representative is lesser well known, and therefore they really rely on their party for information and guidance, and the party has a lot more power. Remember that the House of Representatives initiates all revenue bills, so taxing and spending starts in the House of Representatives. Remember, the House of Representatives, when the founders wrote the Constitution, was the only popularly elected body. And, I've been meaning to make sure you know what plurality means. Plurality means 50% plus one vote, okay? So, the House of Representatives is the one that is most subject to the plurality or majority rule of the common people. Okay. So remember also that the House of Representatives is the ones that if there is a decision to impeach the president, they decide that they impeach the president. They have to come up with the charges. Okay, so they charge the president, and all you need is 50% plus one representative to charge the president for impeachment. And then remember, the trial is held in the Senate. We'll talk more about that in a second. The House of Representatives has a Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee is very powerful because you can't just let everybody stand up. When you have 435 people in a room, you can't just let everybody with some harebrained idea about how they want to amend a bill stand up and try to amend it. You would never get anything done. So the Rules Committee decides what the rules are going to be for amending that bill. And the leadership is the Speaker of the House, who's the leader of the majority party. He's elected by the majority party. And the Speaker has incredible power in this sense, in deciding what bills are going to come to the floor, what rules are going to guide those bills. Are they going to allow amendments? Are they not going to allow amendments? Is it going to be closed to amendments? So that's an important fact of the Rules Committee. So there's also the Speaker, then there's the Majority Leader, there's the Minority Leader, who typically doesn't have a whole lot of power, and then there's whips. Remember that the Speaker is the one who creates all the committee appointments in the House, and typically it's the majority party that holds the chair and the vice chair for each committee. And they typically make sure that they have a majority on every committee. So the Speaker of the House is incredibly powerful. All right, then you have the Senate. The Senate only has 100 people in it, 2 senators for every state, and the age you have to be is at least 35. You do have to live in the state that you represent. Remember then that the Senate is much more smaller. Everyone knows each other. It's a lot more egalitarian. Remember that they ratify treaties with a 2/3 vote, and they confirm officials that the president appoints, and they hold impeachment trials. So if the House chooses to impeach the president, then the trial is held in the Senate with the Chief Justice coming to preside, and you have to have a 2/3 vote to impeach the president in the Senate. Okay? Anyone can make an amendment to a bill on the Senate floor. And the catch is that you have to be able to, if you're going to put in an amendment, then you have to be able to overcome filibuster to make sure that that amendment or the bill can go forward. So there's no point in putting forth an amendment that can't make it through filibuster. And filibuster is 60 votes to break the filibuster. So if you know you don't have 60 votes on the floor, there's just no point in even putting your amendment out there because it's not going to, you're not going to be able to break the filibuster. When you break the, break a filibuster, that's called cloture, C-L-O-T-U-R-E, cloture. And that's when you stop the amendments on the bill and move forward. You move for cloture, which is the bill is now finished. The vice president is supposed to oversee the Senate, but they only have a vote if there's a tie in the Senate. That doesn't happen very often. So unless the vice president just is really looking for something to do, he usually doesn't show up. And the president pro tem, and that is the senior member of the majority party. It's like the guy who's been there the longest. It's kind of more of a symbolic position. The person with the real leadership in the Senate, or the real power, is the Senate Majority Leader. And representatives in the Senate from that party, they are the Senate Majority Leader. There's also a Senate Minority Leader. They don't have very much power. And it's the same as the House, where the Senate Majority Leader decides who's going to head what committees, who's going to be the next in line on each committee, who's going to have the majority on all the committees. And that's usually, obviously, the party that's in power in the Senate. Okay? So keep in mind you can have one party in power in the House, a different party in power in the Senate, and then the president. So that's divided government. That's classic divided government, in which case it's really difficult to get anything done. All right, so that's where committees and subcommittees come into power. So both the House and the Senate have committees. The House has more committees than the Senate. You have standing committees. Standing committees are just the committees that they always have. Okay, so the Ways and Means Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the I've looked at different tests and review packets, and they don't seem to think that you need to know all the names of the committees. So I wouldn't try to memorize all of those. I think that's beyond the range of reasonability. You also have joint committees. Joint committees are when the Senate and the House have something that they want to look at together and investigate it or look into it. They don't usually have a lot of bills come to the floor from joint committees. They're more investigatory kind of committees. Then you have conference committees. The goal of conference committees is to one bill has passed the House, a different worded bill has passed the Senate, and now they got to iron out common language to repass the bill in both houses. The exact same bill has to pass both houses, and that's not typically the way it works the first time out of the gate. So that's what the conference committee does, is they iron out the differences. Then you have select committees. Select committees usually look into a specific issue. So we have right now, a select committee on Benghazi, because they wanted to look at that specific issue. Select committees tend to pop up and then disappear once that issue has gone away. I'm sure in the 1950s we had the House on Un-American Activities Committee, and that was a select committee that was just looking during the Red Scare at who's a communist committee, and through a vote of the entire committee. But you can have a discharge petition. A discharge petition is when forces a bill out of committee for a floor vote. So you can have a discharge position to leverage a bill out of committee. All right, chairs in the seniority system. I think we've kind of already touched that as well. All right, within both the House and the Senate, and sometimes bridging both the House and the Senate, you have caucuses. Oh, y'all are having trouble staying connected. Well, you know what? Every once in a while, my thing flashes. If anybody has any advice for me, if you think it's me, let me know. I'm fully charged. I have 51% power. the good news is I am pretty sure that this whole thing is going to be posted on YouTube. So if this just proves way too frustrating, then let me go through it, and then you can see it on YouTube. Okay? So just kind of decide what your tolerance level is for how frustrating it is to get kicked out. Okay. I haven't been paying very much attention to who's in and out. All right. So, the caucuses. So those are groups of people who share a common interest, and they just want to inform each other, build bonds across their body or across the House and the Senate. So you have the Black Caucus, you have the Women's Caucus, you can have the Farm Caucus, you can have the Urban Caucus. So these are just people who happen to share something in common in terms of their district or their interests, and they get together informally and try and problem solve or come up with ideas or leverage their committees or those kinds of things. All right, all the Congress people have staff. I think a senator has about 40 people on their staff. They have a lot more staff, but the staffers do casework, which means they answer the phones, and if any of the constituents back in that district or in that state need something, they help work those cases. They also help do oversight, so it is the job of Congress to make sure that the government is functioning correctly and that the Environmental Protection Agency is carrying out the laws that they have passed, for example. And if they don't think that the Environmental Protection Agency is doing what they have directed them to do, then they can have hearings and do oversight, okay? Same thing with the IRS, if they don't think the IRS is doing what they're supposed to be doing. They also educate the public, or congressional staffers do. Then the committees have their own staffers as well, and they help do research related to specific issues. Then there are standalone staffers for Congress. One is called the Congressional Research Service. So I've seen this with state legislators who I've worked with who, if they just want to know something, they need to do research and they don't have time to do it themselves, they call in the CRS to do the heavy lifting for them. So I've heard elected officials say, "Oh yeah, I'll get a research staffer on that," and I've asked. Then you have the GAO, the General Accountability Office, and the GAO, they're the ones who try and predict what the different mathematical calculations are for different proposals, and they try and oversee. Oh no, I'm wrong. That's the CBO. The GAO is the the Government Accountability Office. They make sure that all of the parts of the federal government are spending money the way they're supposed to spend it based on law. Okay, so they kind of hold people accountable and like audit all the different agencies. The CBO is the ones who, if a senator has, like, I just talked to a state representative the other day, and he has this idea that we're going to let teachers have an 11th month of employment if they want it. Well, they decided that he would send it out to the CBO and let them do projections on how much that proposal would cost. And then that they're supposed to be nonpartisan and not really be biased in terms of overestimating or underestimating the costs of things. So those are staff agencies for Congress: the CRS, the Congressional Research Service, the GAO, the General Accounting Office, and the Congressional Budget Office. Also, I mean, if you're a little bit lost or you're coming in and out, I mean, this is the exam review sheet that's posted on the internet. So on AngelaScioli.com. So you can always look at this on YouTube and follow right along with the review sheet and feel like you've got a consistency to what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. All right, I have this thing on the review sheet called the congressional process. I don't know what that means, but I'm thinking it must mean something about like how a bill becomes a law. Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it's how a bill becomes law. Okay, so a bill needs a sponsor, and they work out a bill first is assigned to a committee by the speaker or by the majority leader once the bill is filed. So then it goes to the committee. The committee, it usually dies there. That's where most bills go and die, because there's so many bills being filed, and it really takes somebody in a committee, the leader of the committee, to take interest in a bill. If for some reason they take interest in that bill, then they can change it, they can mark it up. It's called a markup. And once they have a bill that they like and they're still committed to, then they can send it to the floor, in which case it's up to the speaker to decide if they will ever call that bill to be debated or considered on the floor. It can die right there again in the speaker's calendar. Also, you can just send the bill to a committee that's just defunct. Like, the repeal of HB 2 has just gone to that state house in North Carolina, and they sent it to the Ways and Means Committee, and that's a way of killing it without killing it because the Ways and Means Committee hasn't met for 3 years. So, then once the Speaker brings the House Majority Leader, the Senate Majority Leaders brings the bill to the floor, then it can be debated based on the rules that they have established in the House, or it can be amended based on Senate and filibuster things. If it passes one House, then it goes to the other one, and then if it passes that one in a different form, it goes to conference committee. And then if it gets out of both the House and the Senate in the same form, then it goes to the President, and the President can sign it. If the President does not sign it, then they can decide if they can override his veto with a 2/3 vote, in which case they pull it back into the House and the Senate for that 2/3 override. Okay, so that's the congressional process. All right, we have, typically, that's the way laws are passed. But we have a very unusual situation going on in American politics right now where we have a lot of polarization. And so we're starting to see unorthodox lawmaking. These are called like omnibus bills. An omnibus bill is a bill that has a little bit of everything in it. It's like, well, we're going to spend some money on this in defense, and oh, we need to pass that thing for the farmers, and we need to... It's just a big, like, trash bill with... Oh, they call it a Christmas tree bill sometimes. It's a bill that just has a whole bunch of unrelated things in it. And sometimes some earmarks, too, because that's what they need to do to sweeten the bill to get it to go through. And it won't even go to committee. Sometimes it goes straight to the floor, and the Speaker will just push it through. So that's the kind of stuff we're seeing lately because government has become so dysfunctional. And they're just always trying to, like, keep government from going off the edge by passing last-minute bills that don't have the whole congressional process involved. All right, party influence is really important in deciding, influencing votes. So let's talk about how you can influence the votes of different members. Party is very important. They're usually the most cohesive about leadership, and that's why the last Speaker race was just so crazy, is because Boehner stepped down. And oh, and by the way, if you've not seen the White House Press Correspondents' Dinner 2016, it was last night, you've got to watch that video. It is hilarious. But John Boehner is in a skit with President Obama. It's hilarious. You just wouldn't believe it. But anyway, when Boehner dropped out, that's why it was such a weird thing that the party couldn't get on the same page about who's going to be their leader, because usually those votes are very quick and 100%, and they've got it all ironed out ahead of time. The least cohesive votes based on party are when they're related to issues that might be controversial, like gun control, or sometimes party members will just kind of go their own way, because especially if the issue is salient, which means that their people back home are paying attention, then they tend to vote their own way because they are working to make sure that they get reelected, more so than making their party leaders happy. And we've had less and less of a tendency to compromise lately because of gerrymandering. So we have a lot of polarization right now in Congress, and very few people who are willing to compromise. And they're pretty much voting right along party lines. Other influences on voting that are not on your review sheet that I'm a little worried about is something called log rolling. Lyndon Baines Johnson was just like a brilliant genius at this. Log rolling is when you say, hey, I'll vote for your bill on this if you'll vote for my bill on this. And then, so you just kind of log roll. You line up your votes ahead of time. Jawboning. You might see this word on the test. I doubt it, but you never know. Jawboning is when a president calls a member of Congress and wants to talk their ear off about a bill. And then you also have if something's pigeonholed. If a bill is pigeonholed, it means it's stuck in committee and you can't really get it out. It's kind of stuck there. There's one more term that I don't have on your review sheet that could be important, and that is poison pill amendments. In the House, this can happen, but also in the Senate. It's when the Speaker or the Majority Leader wants a bill to die. They don't like the bill anymore. They're over it. They will open up the bill to amendments, knowing that someone might put a poison pill amendment in it, which means an amendment about something very, very controversial that just makes the bill basically impossible to pass because it has competing interests in it. That's a poison pill. Okay, remember too that there's a little controversy about how it is you're supposed to vote. Are you supposed to vote to represent your constituency and therefore just take a poll and vote like your people in your district say? Or ideology? This is this trustee idea where they elected you and they trust your judgment and you're supposed to think about the issue and vote the way you think is best. That's trustee leadership. Instructed delegates is more of the take a poll and vote the way your constituents want you to. And politicos are people who do either one based on what is to their political advantage. So if it's an issue that's not very salient, meaning no one's paying attention because it's boring or something, then you'd go with the trustee idea. And if it's something that's highly salient and everyone's paying attention in your district, then you would go with instructed delegates because you want to show that you are representing the people and you want to ensure you get reelected. So we're going to talk about lobbyists and interest groups later, but of course lobbyists and interest groups are extremely important in terms of informing legislators about bills, making them the specialists they need to be, and helping support their committee work, funding their campaigns and making contributions, providing scorecards and endorsements and all of those things. So lobbyists and interest groups are really hand in hand with elected officials. All right, so we're halfway through, 727, not doing too bad. We're moving on to the presidency. So there's a little controversy about the strength of the presidency. You see it spun two different ways. I think it's very interesting. In some ways, the presidency in the Constitution is not covered in nearly the amount of detail. Article 2 is pretty vague. And so some people say that the presidency has been able to expand far beyond because they just kind of drew some guideposts for the post. That the presidency has been allowed to expand far beyond what was intended. And for this, they talk about things like executive orders and executive agreements and foreign policy. Then there's other people who will spin it like we get really all torqued up about presidential elections. But really, the president's power is somewhat more of a myth than a reality in the sense that unless he can influence Congress, unless he's in alignment with Congress, he can't initiate any bills. Remember that. He can only sign the bills that come across his desk. And so he can't initiate legislation. So that really... also, all his treaties have to be approved by 2/3 approval of the Senate. All his appointments have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. So I think right now I'm in the presidency overrated place because we've seen that with President Obama, right? So Congress is a different party than him. So he's just kind of stuck. He doesn't look that powerful to me. He can't pass an immigration bill. He's having to do almost everything by executive order. Ever since he lost control of Congress, he's just kind of been spinning his wheels to some degree. So he can't even get a Supreme Court appointment considered in the Congress. So in some ways right now I think we're seeing the myth behind the power of the presidency. But if you see alignment like Lyndon Baines Johnson or Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Reagan, who was able to reach across party lines and pull Southern Democrats into his tent, under those circumstances the presidency can look very powerful and very much set the agenda. So it just kind of depends on the times, I guess. The 22nd Amendment is the one that moved the inauguration. The elections have always been in November, but the inauguration used to be in March until Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then in 1933, they decided they were sick of waiting for Roosevelt to come save the day. So the 22nd Amendment moved the inauguration to January. And it's been January ever since. Then, of course, the president can be impeached. It takes a majority of the House to come up with the charges and 2/3 of the Senate. We've only had 2 presidents get impeached in American history. One was Andrew Johnson after the Civil War, and he was found not guilty by 1 vote. But he was impeached. President Clinton was impeached, and he was found not guilty and kept his job. So remember that impeachment means that stand trial in the Senate. It does not mean you lose your job. So 2 presidents have been impeached. No president has ever been found guilty. Oh my gosh, you're right. Thank you. That's awesome. It is the 22nd Amendment that does... Oh, that makes sense. It was 1951. Yes, the 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms. God, that's good. Very, very good. You saved me from myself. So that's why it's 1951, not 1933. So let's see. I think that the 20th Amendment is the one that moved the inauguration up. Yes, that's the one. 20th, moved the inauguration up. 22nd, 2 terms. Then the 25th Amendment, it lays out presidential succession in case the president is incapacitated but not dead. And that the vice president can temporarily assume his duties and then hand them back. So that was the 25th Amendment. All right, presidential powers in the Constitution. He is the commander-in-chief. Remember that the commander-in-chief role has gotten very confusing because we assumed that the commander-in-chief would do his job once war had been declared by Congress. But lately, the technology of warfare is such that you can basically destroy half the world in 20 minutes, and there's not enough time for the Congress to declare war during that time period. So that problem became evident in Korea. We fought a war without declaring it, not because of timeliness issues, but it was a UN vote that we agreed to be a part of. And then in Vietnam, we didn't declare war. And so that's become a little tricky. And that's why the War Powers Act, which is a little bit farther down there, but I'll go ahead and talk about it. That's why the War Powers Act was passed after the Vietnam War. It says that the president has to let Congress know within 48 hours if he's deployed troops. And within 60 days has to get Congress to approve that or bring the troops home. We're not sure about the constitutionality of the War Powers Act. I personally think that they needed to amend the Constitution to limit the president's commander-in-chief powers in that way. But so far, no one has tried to buck that system. I bet Donald Trump would be that guy, though. So stay tuned. Let's see. He can negotiate treaties, but he has to have 2/3 vote of the Senate. He can appoint ambassadors. These are his constitutional powers. But again, he has to... ambassadors have to be approved by a majority of the Senate. And his legislative powers say that he must give a State of the Union. It was given in writing until Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and then ever since Woodrow Wilson was president, it has been in person. He can recommend legislation, but he cannot initiate legislation. He can call both houses to a joint session if he would like to address them. He can adjourn them after he has brought them together. And he can veto laws that he does not agree with. Okay? His administrative constitutional powers are that he must execute the law. He must nominate officials. And he can request opinions. And he can fill vacancies. Remember the whole senatorial courtesy thing, though. If he's going to appoint someone to a judge job, he usually floats those names by the senator from that state to make sure that they will support that nomination. And that's not actually written in the Constitution. It's just considered a courtesy. And once that precedent has been established, then all presidents after that have abided by that. Remember, that breaks down with Supreme Court nominations, but it's mainly the district and circuit courts where senatorial courtesy is typically offered. His judicial powers include offering reprieves and pardons and nominating judges that then have to be approved by the Senate. All right. He oversees a large federal bureaucracy and responsive to the president's policies. But at the same time, thanks to the Pendleton Act, after the top level of like cabinet official, vice cabinet secretary, after like the first 5,000 people that he appoints in some way, well, the lower level of the bureaucracy president. So they have what we call neutral competence, where they just are federal employees, term in, term out, doesn't really matter who's president, they keep their jobs, and so they tend to be less responsive to the president's policies and more likely to just do their jobs the way that they neutrally have been prone to do. With Mr. Beauregard, who was our guest speaker, he came and he worked for the Department of Labor, and he talked about how governors come and go, but he just tries to make good relationships with everyone and do his job to the best of his ability. All right, presidents give executive orders. Executive orders direct the bureaucracy as to how they're supposed to carry out the law. And basically, there's limited time and resources. President Obama gave his most recent and most controversial executive order. He basically said, hey, we can't deport 12 million people in the country, so we're only going to deport some of them. So let me tell you which ones we're going to deport, and we're going to offer these other people who have children who are citizens here, or dreamers, or are law-abiding, have been here for a certain number of years, we're going to offer them this other ability to not be deported and to register and get work permits. That was an executive order. And it was not a law that had to be passed. And when he leaves office, the understanding is that it could be changed by a subsequent president. or that subsequent president might choose to let that executive order stand. An executive order stands until a subsequent president takes action to change it, or until Congress passes a law to change it. So, those were not laid out in the Constitution, but they've come to be more and more important, especially in times where it's very hard to pass a law. He does appoint a vice president, and the vice president's role is totally dependent on the president. The vice president can do nothing, and basically never even get a phone call from the president, or the vice president can be integral to a key issue or whatever. So, probably our most involved vice president was George W. Bush's Vice President Dick Cheney, who had his finger in every pot, it seemed. Probably one of the most disengaged vice presidents we've ever had is Harry S. Truman. He'd only been on the job for 80 days, and he knew almost nothing when he assumed the presidency. The president does appoint a cabinet. Today we have 15 cabinet positions, including the Department of Homeland Security, which is the most recent cabinet position created. The cabinet is a little controversial. They are appointed by the president, and they serve at the pleasure of the president. You'll always hear them say that. I serve at the pleasure of the president. He can hire them, fire them at any time, as Andrew Jackson so ably showed us by firing his cabinet 4 times. The president doesn't often call cabinet meetings because they tend to be very divisive, because all the cabinet heads are basically fighting for a piece of pie in terms of money in the federal budget, and they all think that their department is the most important. And so they tend to have a lot of controversy between them. So, I'll say that. The part of the presidency that the president most depends on is the executive office. And one thing I've noticed is in class we talked about all the executive offices and, all the way down to NASA. What I'm noticing in the review texts is that they really don't go down to that granular level of all the executive offices. The ones you really seem to know are the ones that are on your review sheet. So you have the Security Council, and the National Security Committee. And they link the foreign policy objectives of the president with military advisors. They give a daily briefing to the president about all of the national security issues around the country, or around the world, on any given day. And so the NSC, and when I say Security Council, you have the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you have the head of the 3 branches, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and they advise the president. You also have the UN Security Council, so don't get confused with that. The UN Security Council is, Britain, France, China, Russia, and us, the victors of World War II, who sit at the head of the United Nations. So that's a Security Council as well. All right, then they have the Council of Economic Advisors. They're called the COE. They're 3 appointed leaders and advisors to the president about economic issues. I just heard today that the Council of Economic Advisors produced a report where they actually said we should have a minimum wage. And he very forthrightly defended why a minimum wage would not drive it. And I just thought it was a really bold statement by the Council of Economic Advisors. We also do, one thing that's not on is part of the executive office is also the U.S. Trade Representative, who does these international trade pacts, like the TPC, Trans-Pacific, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the U.S. Trade Representative has come under a little bit of scrutiny here lately. Then you have the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. They're the ones who prepare the president's budget. Remember that ever since the 1920s, the president starts the budget process. He puts out the budget that he wants, and then Congress receives it, and if they are not of his party, they usually laugh at it, and they consider it a propaganda piece. Or if they're from his same party, then they consult with that. But the budget does start with the OMB. All right, then he has his White House staff. This can be like the people who make his dinner and pick up his laundry, all the way down to his chief of staff. His chief of staff runs the whole White House staff. And remember the hierarchical versus... So the hierarchical means that the chief of staff has power, and then it goes down like a triangle to the people who are underneath the chief of staff. But then Kennedy and Clinton and some other presidents have had what's called the ideas that come forth. Okay, the president is supposed to lead Congress. He's the chief legislator. This works out better when his party is in power. When his party is not in power, his role as the chief legislator is really not very impressive. There's 3 kinds of vetoes he can have when he gets a law that he doesn't like. It's a regular veto, like, I don't like this bill, within 10 days. Pocket veto means that Congress is going to adjourn before 10 days, and so he can just put it in his pocket and not even talk about it, and it does not become a bill because of the pocket veto. And then the line item veto is very controversial. It allows the president to mark out parts of the bill that he doesn't like. This was done under Clinton, and it was found unconstitutional. So if we want a line item veto, we're going to have to amend the Constitution. Signing statements. Signing statements are when the president is signing a bill, and he gets all these people gathered around, and a lot of times he'll say, like, I really like this bill, or I don't like this part of this bill, or here's how I'm going to enforce this bill, or he draws some attention and the way in which it will or will not be enforced. So that's kind of a new thing that's not in the Constitution, these signing statement ceremonies. Party leadership. The president is leader of his party and has a lot of power as such in terms of appointing people to key positions in the party. The party uses the president a lot when the president is popular. But when the president is not popular, they can tend to want to shove the president in a closet and not pay attention to them. So the degree to which the president truly leads the party is kind of depending on approval ratings. Coattail idea is that if you have a popular person at the top of the ticket for president, that when elections happen in November, that lots of people will show up to vote for that person, and that will benefit the party all the way down the line. So, for example, coming in November, if a bunch of Republicans don't like, let's say the nominee is Trump. If a bunch of Republicans really don't want to vote for Trump, they might just not vote, which means they won't come vote maybe for any of the down ballot offices, which means that could really hurt Republicans who are in tight races against Democrats. It could go the same way too. Let's say that Democrats aren't excited about Hillary, then, or Bernie, then you could have the same down ballot problem. Now, the idea is that coattails are that if the president's very popular, that he'll just carry in a whole bunch of other elected officials with them. But we've actually found coattails to be more myth than reality. Doesn't usually work out that well. All right, then, if a president is elected by a wide majority, or if the next midterm elections, their party gains a lot of seats, then what this usually means is the president will claim a mandate. A mandate means that they are now claiming that they have their agenda needs to be acted on and enacted because they have Americans believe in what they want to do. And that's why presidents, right after they're elected, try and cash in on their mandate very quickly. And in their first 100 days, push through a whole bunch of laws to try and build on that momentum. Security. He negotiates with foreign governments. He commands the armed forces. He can wage war but not declare it. He manages crises around the world, and he can seek support for his policies from Congress. Boy, this is going to get really tough when we have a female president. When we have to say he or she, it's going to be a real difference. Also, the president is the chief diplomat. Is what countries we're going to recognize and what countries we're not going to recognize. And so that's actually a pretty big thing that's not in the Constitution necessarily and shape realities. He can also decide when we're not going to have a relationship with a country and terminate our diplomatic relationships. That's usually putting a building in that country called the U.S. Embassy, or taking that building out of the country called the U.S. Embassy. So when we cut off ties with Cuba, we took our embassy, we put our embassy back. Okay? Treaty negotiations, we've already talked about that. Okay, executive agreements are not in the Constitution. They are basically when the president makes a deal with another country, and it's kind of like executive orders, that leaders acts to change it. So this was really a travesty at the end of the Vietnam War, where Richard Nixon made all these executives about how we would protect the people we had worked with in South Vietnam should South Vietnam fall to communism. And when Gerald Ford then inherited the presidency after Nixon had to resign, he assumed that Congress would the money that was needed to support those executive agreements, and Congress totally bailed. They were so sick of Vietnam, and they didn't follow through on any of those executive agreements, and that was considered to be like a huge travesty. So that's what executive agreements are. They're not quite treaties, but they're treated, it's like the honor and the faith that the president has given his word, and that word will stand and will be good. Because because the credibility of our nation really lies on it. Escalation. He's a crisis manager. I think that's pretty clear. So crises might be natural disasters. That's pretty common. It might be a disease outbreak. It might be drought. It might be, that's a natural disaster, obviously. So the president, when the Challenger disaster happened, when Reagan was president, he was considered to be the soother in chief. That's time for a president to really look presidential and look like he's handling things. Whereas like George W. Bush after Katrina, it was thought that he did not handle that crisis very well, and it really hurt his presidential approval numbers. So crisis managing is actually very important. So working with Congress, it's really thought you have two presidencies. You have your foreign presidencies and you have your domestic. Sometimes presidents, if they're stymied on the domestic front, they can be criticized for just doing foreign stuff all the time. George H.W. Bush was criticized in this way. He had a Congress that was from a different party. And so he just did a whole lot of work in the foreign realm. And because that's where the president has a little bit more leverage and a little bit more leeway. With executive agreements and treaty negotiations and those things. Presidential approval ratings are really important, and they tend to be highest right upon election, and then they tend to go down. President Obama is having a real bounce of his presidential approval ratings. In fact, he talks about that in his White House Correspondents' Dinner. And they're a little perplexed because it's not like he's really able to do much in his last year presidentially, so it's funny to think why his approval ratings are going up. So the president has a press secretary that is part of the White House staff, and they do press conferences in which they try and set the agenda for what's being talked about by the press. Increasingly, though, keep in mind the president has started going straight to the American people through things like Twitter and social media. And more than ever, the White House press corps feels like they've been a little boxed out as a result. Okay, the next part on your review sheet is Congress, the President, and the budget. And I've got to say that I'm not seeing a very detailed level of review on this subject in your review texts. So I've got 10 minutes to review it. I'm just going to kind of walk through it, but I wouldn't stress yourself out. We talked a lot about this in class just because I think it's really important to the future of the democracy that you guys know what the heck's going on with the funding of the country. But I don't think they're going to have that much detail on the test about it. Just my gut. All right, so the government gets money in. It gets money in from income taxes. The 16th Amendment established the income tax in America. It's considered to be a more fair way of taxing than the tariff. The tariff was the default means of funding the government before. And it just caused prices to go up, and it hurt the poor people more than it hurt the rich people. So the income tax, strangely enough, was seen as a preferable alternative to the tariff. So that was the 16th Amendment. Ever since we've passed the income tax, we have the Internal Revenue Service that receives all of the tax money. Okay, there's been arguments about how the income tax should be allotted. The graduated income tax is also the progressive income tax. And what that means, that's kind of the system we have now, where the top income earners in America are supposed to pay around like 32% of their income over a certain amount of money in taxes. So it's like after they earn their first million or something like that, then it goes up to 32% of the remaining income. In reality, we know there's a whole lot of tax loopholes and those things, and Warren Buffett, I think, pays around 20% in the end. Then there's this idea of flat taxes. Flat taxes are usually pretty popular in Republican circles, conservative circles. That's the idea that everyone should just be charged the same amount. Flat, no loopholes, no exemptions, just everyone. They like that idea because it would pretty much get rid of the Internal Revenue Service, and you would just send a postcard saying how much money you earned and here's your check, based on that flat tax idea. Flat taxes, though, would cut the tax rate on the wealthy people, and it would raise taxes on poor people. So getting to the flat tax would actually be kind of controversial in terms of its effects on different populations. And then you have sales taxes. Sales taxes are usually done by local government. Property taxes are usually done by local government. So the federal government typically just relies on the income tax. Then you have social insurance taxes. When you get your paycheck, you'll see that you have FICA, and those are include your Social Security taxes, which are around 6.2% right now, I think. They might be even lower. I think the Obama administration lowered them to like 4.3% or something like that. And within your social insurance taxes is also taxes that go to pay for your unemployment insurance should you ever be unemployed. And then Medicare. So when you get old, you'll have an ability to go to the doctor. So that's up to the government as well. Remember, they're supposed to be putting all that in this trust fund that they haven't done a very good job of doing. And then it should be there when you retire. So then you can have it, but it's not exactly there. All right. Especially now that we're running debts and deficits. And the way they do that is by selling bonds to people and investors. And then the idea is you hold on to that bond for a certain period of time, and then you bring it back, and the government pays you that amount plus the interest. Also, the government borrows from within its own agency. They've gone and raided the Social Security Trust Fund. That's intergovernmental borrowing that happens because policymakers don't want to raise taxes, so they start being very creative about places to find money. And they mean to pay it back. I'm sure they do. Then you have structural debt versus the 1980s. The debt we had was temporary debt. It was like, oh, we were fighting World War II, so we're going to run debt and then we're going to pay it back. Structural debt, which just means that the growth of the federal government has grown and we don't have the political will to tax ourselves at the rate to pay for it. And so that's why we have a runaway debt total. Now, actually, because of sequestration, our deficit has shrunk. And the growth of the debt has actually shrunk, but we still came into the Obama administration with like $15 trillion worth of debt, and now we have so excited about that. All right, tax loopholes are ways in which people can avoid paying taxes because they are given these special loopholes. So I don't benefit from any tax loopholes that I could think of, so I can't really give you a great example. Maybe rich people who, instead of getting paychecks to make their money, they get capital gains. And I think that the first part of your money you make through capital gains doesn't get taxed. So that's an example. It wasn't a paycheck, though. So they don't count that money as money. That'd be a loophole. All right, then tax expenditures. These are things you don't pay. You don't pay taxes. Your tax bill is lowered. And so it actually is a subsidy. So they give you like a credit if you have children, a dependent tax credit. So that's a way in which they encourage people to have children. Then there's a mortgage income tax exemption. So that allows you to, they want to encourage home ownership and people living in their homes and keeping their neighborhoods nice and that stuff. So that would be examples of tax expenditures or subsidizing certain behavior in American society. Tax indexing, it was introduced by the Reagan administration. It just says since inflation is constantly going on, and we've said if you make this amount of money, your tax rate goes up, well, that needs to adjust with inflation so that as inflation happens, you don't make you don't keep getting your taxes raised just because of inflation, is what tax indexing does. Sequestration is when the government started when they couldn't arrive on a budget because of polarized government, then they started saying, okay, if we don't have a budget passed by this date, we're going to just cut government across the board on all departments by this amount. And it was like using a baseball bat to cut the size of government as opposed to a scalpel. So the idea was that surely they would be reasonable and they would not hit themselves with a baseball bat. Instead, they would pass a bill that would be more scalpel-like. But we've seen that we've actually had sequestration, and that's why the deficit is growing slower. Is because they've actually used a baseball bat to just cut the size of government across the board. So, federal expenditures just means the things we're spending our money on. Remember that most over half of our budget goes to entitlement programs, which basically means programs to help elderly people like Social Security and Medicare. And remember that disability is a part of the Social Security program as well. So we also spend a very large segment of our budget on defense. And the rest of that is called discretionary spending. And we spend a lot less on discretionary spending than most people would believe. So it's our entitlement programs that are really driving our expenditures at this point. The rise and decline of the national security state. I'm thinking about that, but I'm not sure what that refers to. I mean, I know the rise of the national security state, that was around the 1950s, and the military-industrial complex, which is when Eisenhower said, hey, you know how companies make money, like Lockheed Martin, is they make planes and weapons, and they want to sell them to the military, and military people, they want to get more stripes on their sleeve, and the only way they get more stripes on their sleeve is if they go to war. So suddenly we have kind of a pact between the military and the corporations that they can get more fat government contracts if we go to war. And so we could have suddenly the military and industry driving our foreign policy agenda. So that's what the military-industrial complex is. And remember that the United States is like got a 20 times larger military than any other country in the world. So our expenditures on the military are quite disproportionate to other countries, first world countries around the world. So I'm just not sure why we would say the decline of the national security state, because I still feel like we have a pretty healthy national security state going on. Social service state started in the 1960s. That's with Social Security. Well, we had Social Security since the 1930s, but Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, food stamps, disability, all of that began in the 1960s. In 2004, President George W. Bush passed a prescription drug benefit that was not funded by taxes, so that has also increased our social spending. Incrementalism is the idea that we just keep building the budget on top of what already exists, and we think this leads to kind of runaway, uncontrollable expenditures. And also, entitlements. We don't know how much we're going to spend on entitlements because we set these categories for who qualifies. And if you qualify, you get the benefit, and we have no way of knowing how many people are going to be disabled in the next 5 years. We have no way of predicting who's going to apply for food stamps. The idea, though, is once you meet the requirement for food stamps, you get them, and that's how these are uncontrollable expenditures. Okay, the budgetary process, our time is up. I've got 1 minute. I just don't know that any of that is going to be on the test. If it is, it's one of those questions that, like, only 10% of you are supposed to get anyway. So let me look at some more review texts and sample exams, and if I decide that that's necessary, I'll come back and do it when we do policy. We're going to do a review on policy, so I'll just table that until that review session. Okay? So it is 8 o'clock. Hour's up. I know that y'all have had some connectivity problems, so I'm going to just work really hard to get this posted on YouTube. And I know I didn't benefit from getting many of your comments, and I'm sorry about that. I will look at the comments on YouTube, though, and of course you can always email me at ascioli@wcpss.net. Sometimes my remind ability to text works, sometimes it doesn't. Remember to come this Thursday during Smart Lunch to look at your AP final exam. And that might be of some interest to you as well. I'll send out a reminder about that also. Okay? So thanks to those of you who hung in there. Thanks to the rest of you who tried. And thanks to everyone else who will watch this video at a later time. I hope it will be of some benefit. Always happy to have feedback, so just let me know, yo. See ya.